Who among us has ever pondered life's greatest question? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, we've all heard this, right? We're all pretty familiar with how the discussion mostly goes. Its equally important sibling, of course, is Nicolas Cage the greatest actor of our time or a crazy person? But let's just focus on the one. That's a good answer, actually. This question of the chicken or the egg has been troubling people for a really impressively long time. Aristotle concluded that it was an infinite loop that had no answer. 400 years after Aristotle, a guy named Plutarch wrote that it was really a question of if the world even had a beginning. Later, Macrobius, who we talked about a little bit when we were talking about King Herod, called it a question of great importance. Now, as years went by, Christians decided that they had the answer. And the answer was, obviously, the chicken came first. Because God made the chicken. This was the accepted answer for centuries. Until the theory of evolution came to be more understood and accepted, and it now is agreed that it was an egg that came first, an egg that was laid by an almost chicken. It's really the best way to describe it. A different version of this paradox, yet also just as solved, is what comes first? Do Christians reach out to God, or does God reach out to us? I'll give you a hint. We as Lutherans are pretty much agreed that God reaches out to us first. But, there's some variation there. But this seems like it should be an important question. Are we the ones that make the first step, or does God? Is God the one that grows faith in us, or do we have faith of ourselves? And I think the Sermon on the Mount actually gives us the answer. The answer, of course, for us as Lutherans is that God is the one who makes the first move. So this section of the gospel opens with Jesus around a large crowd. And he goes up on a mountain and starts to teach. And he opens with these statements about happiness or blessedness, which we call the Beatitudes. These are statements that are kind of backwards. I mean, happy are people who are hopeless isn't usually something that you put together. Same with people who are grieving, humble, hungry, thirsty, merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers, harassed, or persecuted. Those aren't usually groups of people who are happy. But that's what Jesus says. Happy are the hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. That verse especially seems odd because aren't we told in the Bible over and over again to have hope? Isn't hope kind of the big deal that we're all about here? We have hope in the resurrection. We have hope in the promises of God. And yet Jesus says, happy are the hopeless. And then he says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's odd. And yet, it also is the thing that answers the question. Because if we are hopeless, we know that we can't reach out to God on our own. When we are hopeless, we know that our righteousness will never be as great as that of the Pharisees and the legal experts. I mean, these are people whose whole lives were built around following God's law. How can we match up to that? A little bit later in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes it even harder. That if we want to reach God on our own, we need to be as perfect as God himself. It's enough to make you hopeless. Because that's the standard that becomes set. If we want to reach out to God, we need to be as perfect as God. And if we're as perfect as God, then we don't really need him anyways. And so Jesus says, happy are the hopeless. Because it's when we are hopeless that we realize that God is the one who gives us hope. It's when we realize that God is the one who makes that first step for us. In Romans 10, Paul describes the difference between trusting our own righteousness and our own actions and trusting God's righteousness and God's actions. They try to establish their own righteousness, but Christ is the goal of the law, which leads to righteousness for all who have faith in God. When we realize that our own righteousness won't save us, when we realize that we cannot be the ones to make that first step, then we have the kingdom of God. We are saved by what God does for us and not by what we do. I mean, that's the good news, right? And yet that's not all there is. Because while it is great news that for the hopeless, the kingdom of God is theirs, doesn't that statement also imply a little bit of action? Happy are the hopeless, for theirs is the kingdom of God. But also happy are the grieving. They'll be comforted. The humble will inherit the earth. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled. The merciful will receive mercy. The pure in heart. All these things also involve some action. Being a peacemaker means you can't sit on the sidelines. If you're being harassed and persecuted because of the kingdom of God, you're obviously not just sitting down and enjoying the presence of the kingdom of God. You're doing something. So there is a call to action. And we see that in Psalm 1. Psalm 1 describes the truly happy person like a tree planted by water. They love God's law, they follow God's teaching, but it also describes a truly happy person as not following the wicked, not standing with sinners, not sitting with the disrespectful. The righteous person both abides in God and sits, stands, and walks. Now we've got a real paradox going on here. How do we reconcile this, that we are both not saved by our actions and yet called to action? It's because we need to realize that a righteous person does not make themselves righteous. Because our righteousness comes from God. It is God declaring us righteous. God looking at us when we are hopeless and saying, you are happy. You have the kingdom of God. Looking at us when we are grieving and says, you are happy. You will be comforted. And looking at us when we are struggling with all the things around us and giving us the hope that we do need. And looking at us when we are hungry and thirsty for that righteousness and telling us that we will be filled. This is all great. But right after Jesus says all of these things that God does for us, he says, you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. Now, I like salt. Salt is good. Put a little salt on your food, it brings the flavors out quite a bit better. And that's mostly what we use salt for. But back in the day, that wasn't the only use for salt. Salt wasn't a seasoning. It was a preservative. Now, How many of you like beef jerky? Yeah. Beef jerky is delicious. That is meat that has been salted to within an inch of its life and a little bit beyond, but it keeps. That beef jerky will last forever. Almost forever. In my house, it usually doesn't last an hour. But, because salt preserves things. Salt keeps things fresh so that they will last longer in an era in which refrigerators weren't a thing. Our Norwegian Lutheran brethren and sisters decided that lye was a good thing for that and made terrible fish. But, that's okay. I'll stick with beef jerky. So Jesus is saying, you are the salt of the earth. You are the earth's preservative. Isn't that an interesting picture? But if salt doesn't do its job, what good is it? If my fridge breaks, you need to fix the thing that broke. It's not doing its job of preserving my food. If salt's not doing its job preserving your food, you need a better option. But then Jesus takes it to a point of being absurd to make his point. And it's really smart. You are the light of the world. But who lights a light and then puts a cover on it? If you're going to light a lamp, so lamps, you've seen oil lamps, you light the lamp, you put it somewhere, and it lights up your room. But if you're going to light an oil lamp, why would you put something on top of it? It's absurd. But when we don't shine the light of God in the world, that's what we're doing. In the illustrious words of a certain children's song, hide it under a bushel. No. You let it shine. That's how it works. If you can put it in a kid's song, it's got to be an easy concept. But yet we do it all the time. We hide God's light. We don't act like salt. That's always what humanity's purpose has been, to show God's light in the world. To be an image of God. That was the thing that humans were created to be. When God called Abraham, he called Abraham to be a blessing to the entire world. God's people have always been bad at shining his light. And yet that's still our call. At the end of Matthew, when Jesus leaves his disciples, he says to them, go into the whole world and shine that light. Because that's what it's all about. We find ourselves hopeless, hungering and thirsting for righteousness. God comes to us and says, happy are you. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. Your thirst and hunger will be filled. Shine God's light in the world. Season and preserve the earth. That's how it works. God reaches out to us and we go and do. And that is good news. Because we know that as we go and do, God is with us. We know that the promises that he has given us aren't anything that we did, and so we can go and do with joy. Because God plants us by streams of water is why we can walk with him, why we can stand in faith, and why when we need to, we can sit and rest with him. He calls us righteous so that we can show his righteousness. And that's our answer. God reaches out to us and makes us the light of the world to show everyone else what God has done so that they too can have God reach out to them. But we are the instruments through which God reaches people. We are the ones that show people what his love is. We are the ones who show what his light is. We are the ones who bless others so that they can know what God's blessings are like. So that our happiness that we find in God rubs off on them. And so that God's light shining through us will shine on them. That's what it is to be the salt and light in the world. To be in the world, preserving it, shining on it, so that everyone can know God. Everyone who is hopeless can find their hope in him. Everyone who hungers and thirsts for righteousness can find righteousness in him. Everyone who grieves can find comfort in him. Because that's what it's all about. He reaches out to us so that we can reach others, so that everyone can know him.